Hey, everybody, and welcome back to Books and Gratitude, the podcast where we talk about books, the stories that stay with us, and of course, the things we're grateful for. Today, I'm reviewing Neuralian Chronicles, The Siege, Volume 1, Inception, by Brandon Hall. Now, before I get into the book itself, I want to share a little bit about how this review came about. I am good friends with Brandon's wife, Kimberly. So when they asked me if I'd be interested in reading and reviewing Brandon's book, I said yes without hesitation. Of course I would. But friendship doesn't automatically earn a book 5 stars. The book still has to earn it, obviously, and this one did. So I'm giving Inception a full 5 stars. And don't worry, this episode is completely spoiler free. So let's dive in. Inception is one of those books that's difficult to place neatly into a single genre. There's science fiction, there's fantasy, mythology, there's spirituality and metaphysics, there's alternate history, there's supernatural mystery. And my friends know how I feel about supernatural things. There are elements of ancient civilizations, cosmic beings, different dimensions, consciousness, dreams, and the idea that what humanity considers mythology might have roots in something much more complicated. And somehow, Brandon brings all of that together around a very human central character. His name is Anthony Griggs. Now, Anthony is a 22-year-old artist, writer, student, and lifelong dreamer. And dreamer is the on point here. He's also somebody who's survived a difficult childhood. Books, art, imagination, and storytelling became a refuge for him long before the extraordinary events of this novel begin. His imagination isn't just a hobby, it's part of how he understands himself and the world around him. And then Anthony begins experiencing things that aren't so easy to explain. He can't explain them as imagination anymore. His dreams become increasingly vivid. His visions seem to contain information he shouldn't know. And reality begins behaving in a way that challenge everything he believes about time and space, consciousness, and even history. And Anthony has to start asking frightening questions. What if these aren't dreams at all? His journey becomes intertwined with Ellsworth Sied, an elderly researcher and librarian whose mysterious circumstances become one of the catalysts for Anthony's awakening, and Braden Sied, who gradually becomes an important part of Anthony's attempt to understand what's happening to him. And at one point, Braden recognizes that Anthony isn't just experiencing random events. There's a much larger pattern forming around him, and Anthony may be a crucial part of it. That's kind of where the enormous scope of the story begins to reveal itself. Because Inception isn't only about a young man discovering unusual abilities. It's about the nature of reality itself. Brandon builds a mythology in which ancient traditions and civilizations, spiritual beliefs and cosmic forces, and familiar mythological figures may all be pieces of a much bigger story. Egyptian mythology plays an important role too, and so does Norse mythology. There are actually influences from African traditions, Greek mythology, biblical concepts, ancient cosmology, metaphysical ideas, and so many other belief systems. And rather than treating these traditions as completely separate, the novel asks the reader to consider the possibility that different cultures may have been interpreting pieces of the same enormous reality through different languages and symbols and stories. That's really an ambitious idea, and this is a really ambitious book. The mythology surrounding figures such as Netjuru, Orisha, Aesir, Elohim, Jinn, and so many others gradually become part of a much larger conflict involving different realms and different interpretations of humanity's past. There's also a strong emphasis on frequency, consciousness, duality, balance, creation, and interconnectedness. And one of the concepts introduced early in the novel is the idea of existence beginning with consciousness, thought, vibration, and frequency. The word ashe becomes connected to creation, affirmation, and the idea of bringing something into being. And that's something I really enjoyed about this novel. It isn't afraid of big ideas. I mean, like really big ideas. Brandon isn't just telling us that another world exists somewhere. He's asking questions about where these worlds come from, what consciousness is, whether time is actually linear, how myths are created, how history becomes distorted, whether different realities can coexist, and what happens when an ordinary human being suddenly becomes capable of seeing beyond the boundaries everyone else accepts as normal. That's a lot to put in one novel. But don't fret. This is volume 1. And what keeps Inception from becoming nothing but mythology and world building is Anthony himself. I really liked him. He is smart, artistic, curious, sarcastic, my kind of people. He's frightened and stubborn. He's funny and sometimes completely overwhelmed, which really feels appropriate. I mean, if reality suddenly started breaking its own rules around me, I don't think I'd calmly say, "Interesting, tell me more." I would probably react a lot more like Anthony. He is constantly trying to figure out whether he's discovering something extraordinary or just losing his mind. That would be me. And because he's so human, we're able to experience this enormous world through him rather than just being given pages of mythology. And there's also Audrey. I think Audrey is important to the emotional heart of this story. Anthony's life might be expanding into something cosmic, but Audrey represents home. She knows the person underneath everything that's happening. Their relationship has history. It has friendship. It has love. And it has that wonderful familiarity that comes from two people who have known each other long enough to recognize when something isn't right. Anthony might be pulled toward mysteries he can't explain, but Audrey keeps reminding us that there's still an ordinary life attached to all of this. Somebody loves him. Somebody worries about him. Somebody wants him to come back when his mind begins to drift somewhere else that she can't follow. And at one point, another character describes Audrey as the kind of anchor Anthony may need when his dreams become too loud. I thought that was a beautiful way of describing their relationship. There are enormous things happening in this story, but relationships matter. Family definitely matters. Friendships matter. Love, yes, that matters also. And more importantly, all connections matter. Anthony grew up learning that he had to survive mostly on his own. Part of his journey is discovering that he doesn't necessarily have to carry everything alone. That becomes especially meaningful in this relationship with Brayden and Ellsworth Sied. The novel also does something I personally find fascinating in speculative fiction. It plays with that uncomfortable boundary between myth and history. Because we tend to put mythology in one box and history in another. But what happens when those boxes start overlapping? What if ancient stories are exaggerated memories? What if gods were beings people didn't understand? That one gets me because I don't think still people understand gods or God, regardless of what you believe. And what if civilizations exist differently than we've been taught? That one I think is very true. What if events remembered as mythological weren't completely fictional? What if there's a kernel of truth in all that? Again, I also think that's true. Inception has a lot of fun with those questions. And when I say a lot, I mean this is a very detailed book. This isn't a quick, light read, not by any means. There are characters that you need to remember. There are civilizations. There are relationships of all kinds. There are realms. That's intriguing all by itself. And there are mythological connections, also very interesting. And there are philosophical and metaphysical ideas. Those are more common than the others, but still very important. And there are moments when the story moves from intimate conversations into enormous visions of existence. You have to pay attention, but I actually appreciated that. Brandon clearly put an extraordinary amount of imagination into building this universe. He isn't just borrowing mythology because familiar names sounded interesting. He's actually creating connections among cultures and traditions and then using those connections to develop his own mythology. I found that very interesting. There are moments in this book when the scale becomes enormous, but then the story returns to Anthony, Audrey, Braden, Ellsworth, and the relationships that kept everything emotionally grounded. And that's probably one of the biggest reasons I'm giving it 5 stars. The story has spectacle, but it also has heart. Anthony isn't compelling because of what he might become. He's compelling because of who he already is. He's somebody shaped by trauma who is still in possession of compassion and empathy. He's a dreamer who spent his childhood using stories to escape reality, not to only to discover that those stories might have been preparing him to see reality differently. He's somebody who spent much of his life feeling separate from other people and suddenly finds himself connected to something unimaginably larger. And through him, the novel keeps returning to one central idea. There may always be more than what we can see. More to history, more to mythology, more to consciousness, more to the people around us, and maybe even more to ourselves. I also want to mention the visuals. The book includes artwork that immediately establishes the scale and tone of the story, including imagery surrounding Anthony and the extraordinary forces his journey is going to eventually bring him into contact with. It gives the novel almost a graphic novel or illustrated mythology feeling in places, which fits Anthony perfectly because art is already such an important part of who he is. So, who would I recommend this book to? I'd recommend Neuralian Chronicles, The Sied, Volume 1, Inception, to readers who enjoy epic speculative fiction, science fiction blended with fantasy, mythology, ancient mysteries, metaphysics, supernatural stories, alternate interpretations of history, cosmic world building, and books that really aren't afraid to ask enormous questions. That would be this book. And it's especially suited to readers who like stories where mythology isn't just decorative, it's part of the machinery of the world. And I think that's true outside of novels. That's that's my opinion. And while this book has plenty of action and mystery, I think the real appeal is discovering just how large Brandon's universe is becoming. Like I said before, this is volume 1, and the title Inception is quite appropriate because this feels like the opening of something much bigger. My rating, I'm giving Neuralian Chronicles, The Sied, Volume 1, Inception, by Brandon Hall, 5 stars. 5 stars for creativity, for ambition, for mythology and world building, for creating a protagonist that I actually cared about, and 5 stars for taking some enormous ideas and still remembering that the emotional relationships between the characters are what give those ideas meaning. I'm very glad Brandon and Kimberly asked me to read it. I would have said yes because of our friendship, but I'm giving the book 5 stars because the book earned them. As always, I'd like to finish with a few words of gratitude. Today, I'm grateful for friendship. I'm grateful for the people who trust us enough to share something they've created. That's hard to do. Writing a book requires incredible amount of vulnerability. That's why it's so hard. You're taking something that existed inside your imagination, sometimes for years, and handing it to somebody else. You're basically saying, here, this means something to me. Tell me what you think. That's an enormous act of trust. I'm grateful Brandon and Kimberly trusted me enough to share this book with me. I'm also grateful for imagination. A lot of people don't like that word, but I think without it, you can't see beyond what's in front of your face. I'm grateful for the ability to wonder and to ask questions and to create worlds that don't exist and sometimes use those worlds to help us understand the one that does. I'm grateful for books that remind us that we're never too old to be curious. That's why we write. That's why we read. That there's always something else to learn, something else to discover, another perspective we haven't considered. And I'm grateful for the people who become our anchors, the ones who recognize when we're drifting, the ones who reach for our hand, the ones who remind us that no matter how complicated life becomes, we don't have to navigate it entirely by ourselves. Finally, I'm grateful for stories, for the ones that comfort us, the ones that challenge us, the ones that make us laugh, the ones that make us think, and especially the ones that remind us that sometimes the most interesting questions we can ask is simply, what if there's actually more? So that's it for today's episode of Books and Gratitude. Thank you for listening. Thank you for supporting books and authors. And until next time, keep reading, keep wondering, and always find something to be grateful for. Please remember to like, subscribe, and comment, and please share with other book lovers. Thank you, and have a great day.